Dieter's heart raced as he called aloud words of a magical nature. Tobias prepared himself for a magical attack that never came. Instead, from the shadows in the trees, formed a horse that raced quickly towards Dieter. Tobias recognized it as the magical mount he had ridden upon earlier in the trip. Dieter was trying to escape. Tobias quickly drew a bolt to shoot, but stopped again to watch what seemed like thousands of ravens suddenly pouring down out of the sky, as if they were coming from Manslieb itself towards the clearing. Dieter was saddened that he would have to leave. He would be an outlaw now. He would just have to accept it and live with it. Yes, live. And living was going to be uncertain now that he could not guarantee the others would survive. Leaving was the last thing he wanted to do, but he decided it was going to be the way of things. Just as Dieter's magical horse reached the clearing, a mass of black flapping shapes tore down into its path, forming a wall of feathers, clawed feet and beaks that so many ravens would. The horse smashed against the living shield, scattering some birds from the impact, but nonetheless it was stopped as its speed made it tear apart and dissipate into the spirals of ether and shadow that it had originally been drawn from. Dieter cursed more. A whistling sound of a bolt coming through the air grabbed his attention again as Tobias had fired upon him. The shot had been aimed at his shoulder in an attempt at taking him down without making a kill. Dieter had instinctively raised his beastman-derived gauntlet and smacked the bolt aside with the bone plating on it. He had gotten lucky. He wasn't going to ever try that again. But Tobias had already reloaded and was about to fire once more. Dieter quickly dived through the partially splitting wall of birds as the shot was fired. It whizzed into the storm of black creatures and disappeared amongst it all. As the birds flew up and away back towards the moon, Dieter was nowhere to be seen. Tobias suddenly smelt hedge magic at work, as Dieter had appeared at the halfling's flank, stepping quickly from a shadow. He hurriedly jammed his stave up and through the gap in the crossbow, rendering it momentarily useless. Dieter then quickly tugged on the stave, which had remained entwined with the crossbow, which was pulled out of Tobias's hands. Just at that moment, though, Tobias had landed a reaching punch into Dieter's cheek, impacting teeth, which made the crossbow slip off and go flying away from either of their grasps. Dieter brought his stave about in a defensive manner. Tobias, too, readied his from his back. The halfling spoke.
"I did not want it to come to this death. I really didn't."
Dieter licked his lips. "I did." Tobias brought the stave up in defense as Dieter began to attack. For a short while the two of them battled with their staffs. Each of them got in a few good shots on the other, some blows to make them realize that things were turning ugly. Dieter had even tried magically quickened hypnosis on the halfling, but Tobias had shrugged that off too. The effects of the warpstone on his mind had even made him resistant to that now. After the halfling had backflip-kicked Dieter onto his back, Tobias threw down his stave and pulled his robes off, revealing the black leathers underneath. Dieter knew what this meant. Tobias drew both of his boot daggers and made ready to come at Dieter again. Dieter spoke. "Can't you see? You're being used. The raven's coming like that. It's a plan to set you against me." Tobias answered.
"I do not feel I am doing anything against my own nature. I am apprehending a dangerous felon."
Dieter came back with, "Good luck with that." The trainee doctor threw down his stave and drew his hands into the shape to hold a weapon. In mere seconds, the amethyst stave was in his hands again. He spun it purposely, each move looking dangerous enough to kill the halfling in one shot. Tobias, though, was now in a new frame of mind, one where he could access his most quickest of reactions. The halfling tore forward at a pace so fast that it did not suit his size. Dieter spun the weapon of death so fast that it looked like a concerto of scythe blades that whirred, a dark minor key in unison. Dieter thrust with the blade storm, trying to envelop the halfling in it. Tobias, though, was too agile, leaping up and over the weapon and its wielder like a pole vaulter. He landed on the other side and lunged one blade into the back of Dieter's leg. The man screamed in frustration and swung the weapon around again. Tobias easily ducked under it, his size helping with this task as he sliced a dagger up Dieter's face, tearing into his ear and gouging on through the hair into the scalp. The head wound was deep. Dieter was shaken up by the skill of his opponent. He touched his finger to the wound and tasted the blood. He realized that it had at least not been poisoned, or else the battle would have already been over. Too hastily the halfling had come at him. Too quickly had Dieter underestimated him. He shook his head to clear his blurring vision as two pictures of proceedings before him threatened to confuse his mind. At least both pictures agreed with the input they were receiving, as the visions of two Tobiases charging him warned his senses that he needed to act now. Dieter swiped outwards and forward rolled through the attack. Had Tobias lunged with a dagger as he intended, the whirling blade would have taken his arm off. Dieter was impressed with the halfling's quick decision-making in battle. Tobias, of course, was impressed with himself, as usual. Dieter pulled the winds of magic about him like a cloak, which expressed itself as shadows came about him in protection. An etheric armor was now in place. He had to shut out the pain to his leg and head. Tobias spoke.
"It's a risky business, relying on magic as you do,"
Dieter replied.
"Who said I was afraid of risk?"
Dieter charged with his scythe, deciding that the two visions were almost close enough to being one that he might now be able to mount a counter-offensive. As Dieter's scythe came down, he realized his mistake. He should have attacked with his side-arcing swipe. A foe with short-ranged weapons such as daggers would be put at a bigger disadvantage from that. Tobias saw the scythe come at him and saw his opportunity, trusting in his skill. He decided to not roll away from the attack. He raised both of his daggers quickly, having them nearly meet at their ends to catch the scythe as it came to him. Tobias dropped a dagger and grabbed Dieter's arm, concentrating his force into it. The clandestine hedge wizard felt the magic that naturally lived in his body waver. The halfling's anti-magical repulsion abilities, he remembered now. This one had learned how to use his natural talent of magical resistance outwardly by contact through skin. Dieter cursed as he felt the magic drain out of his body, and the scythe he tried to swing at Tobias to cut him no longer existed. Dieter ended up swinging thin air at the halfling instead. Tobias countered this with a jump kick into Dieter's face. The man forced himself not to fall over. He told himself he wouldn't, that he would be very cross with himself if he did. Dieter drew his crisp blade in one hand and his scalpel in the other. He decided to play the halfling at his own game, and seeing as he was ambidextrous, it wasn't too hard for him to do. Tobias drew another dagger, making Dieter wonder just how many of them he kept concealed on him. Then they clashed. Weapon struck weapon, with whirring bodies dancing this way and that. When people would see Dieter perform feats of great agility that defied his disabled reputation, they failed to understand a very important factor. Dieter wasn't lying. He truly couldn't perform these amazing feats with his body, as bad as it was. But he wouldn't ever catch himself saying that. It was because he didn't think about it that he was able to do it. He defied his body and went through the pain. As one who had known mainly pain all of his life, this test meant very little to him. Tobias's dagger sunk into Dieter's arm, just below the gauntlet he wore. In response, Dieter's scalpel tore a chunk of flesh away from Tobias's chin and chest. It lay on the floor, and he quickly began bleeding from the wound. Dieter stabbed the crisp blade forward, but it did not make contact with the halfling. Tobias jumped backwards with a leap far beyond what a normal person would be capable of, and while in mid-air, he threw one of his many daggers at Dieter. It hit the physician in training, striking him into the chest. But the shadowy armor had formed up around it in a goop-like state, stopping its full entry into the man's body. Dieter plucked it out with only a minor wound. Had the otherworldly shield not been there, the dagger would have buried itself up to the hilt and had been on target with his heart. Dieter was impressed again. Even though Tobias had robbed him of his magic, the other was still very active inside. He was drawing from this source of power instead. Dieter bared his scalpel at Tobias, taunting him.
"Come on then, we'll finish this finally."
The winner can say my name however they want. Dieter's dark humour was as always lost on the halfling, but Tobias did at least respond to the challenge element, bringing both of his daggers into attack positions and charging Dieter. This would be a killing move, he told himself. Dieter was too dangerous to apprehend in any other way. He knew exactly how he could do it too. A two-dagger attack that Dieter would never see coming in time. As Tobias raced on, Dieter charged too, taking Tobias by surprise at the gap closing quicker than he had expected. As Tobias reached Dieter, he launched his first dagger downwards into the man's foot. It impaled right on target. He wasn't sure how far the dagger had gone in though, because of the magical barrier Dieter had about him. All Dieter could do was respond with his arm outwards towards Tobias. Tobias knew it was time for the killing blow. His other dagger would now sail with him loosely in his hand towards Dieter's throat from his jump. The first dagger was merely misdirection. It was indeed a killing blow, but not in the way it was intended. A blade that had shot out of his hand into a thrown velocity that impacted its target skull, going right through the head cleanly and killing him outright. As one of them dropped, the other remained standing. Tobias stared at Dieter, a look of remorse in his gaze. He hadn't truly wanted to do this. He knew he had to, though. That stare did not end, for it was Tobias's deathly visage, the last expression that had been on his face as Dieter's crysknife had left his hand. The thrown blade had reached the halfling before the jumping thrust could ever reach Dieter. Dieter looked down at the corpse and spoke quietly. Actually, you were right. My name is Death. Within moments, Dieter's chest was ablaze with pain. He knew what this was. He pulled his shirt open and could see the will-wart sigil burning away into his body. He refused to scream in pain, simply scrunching his eyes closed and gritting his teeth together. The hurt was terrible as he stumbled his way across to Tobias's crossbow and bit on the wood, roaring with the torture. The pain eventually began to de-intensify, and as Dieter looked at his smoking chest, he could see the area was now replaced by a scar. This, though, was a deep tissue scar that led all the way down to the bone, scarring the bone itself as well. All Dieter wanted to do was rest, but he couldn't do that. He had to decide how he was going to handle things from here. He limped over to the halfling's body and knelt down to it painfully, then gave a huge sigh of mixed feelings at how proceedings had unfolded. He yanked on his crysknife, pulling it free of the skull with some effort. As it came free, Dieter saw that it had somehow pierced the piece of warpstone that was previously embedded into Tobias. Dieter also realized that this was too much of a coincidence to be purely accident. He wondered what dark power was influencing this. With a handkerchief, he quickly wrapped the warpstone shard up and put it into his pocket. He laughed to himself and spoke. Looks like I gave you that operation to remove the warpstone after all. Dieter put a hand across Tobias's face and brought his palm down across the eyelids, bringing them to a close. He had gone too far. Just as he stood again, resting his weight upon the stave, the eyes of Tobias's corpse opened. The eyes revealed were suddenly deathly white looking. The corpse spoke, but not in Tobias's voice. It was the voice of Moore.
Now you have your answer. Do not think to petition me with your prayer and desire. Be it for good or ill, it is now as you wished. You are another step closer to me.
The voice faded away and Tobias's eyes closed again. Dieter began to tremble a little. Something deep inside of him, something primal now, began to understand the trouble he was in. The very next thing Dieter did was to throw Tobias's journal into the campfire and watch it burn.